When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
This is a real good story about Bronx and his dad, Ryan, real United Airlines customers.
We were returning home, and one of the flight attendants asked Bronx if he wanted to see the flight deck and meet Captain Andrew.
I got to sit in the driver's seat.
I grew up in an aviation family, and seeing Bronx kind of reminded me of myself when I was that age.
That's Andrew, a real United pilot.
These small interactions can shape a kid's future.
It felt like I was the captain.
Allowing my son to see the flight deck will stick with us forever.
That's how good leads the way.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. As we've seen in the course of our journey through presidential history, quite often, the personal and political aspects of the life of the chief executive are intertwined. There's an expectation that someone who is successful personally is the type of person that we would want as president. But as my guest for this episode, Megan Gorman, demonstrates, sometimes successful presidents struggle with their personal finances, while some others who were high achievers personally ended up not meeting their political goals. In her book, All the President's Money: How the Men Who Govern America Govern Their Money, Megan explores the personal finances of all the chief executives and shares with readers what insights we can gain from these examples, both in terms of learning more about the individuals, as well as the best practices and points to avoid in our own personal financial journey. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. I am so excited to share this discussion with you and cannot thank Megan enough for the time and the insight that she provided in combining her personal interest in presidential history with her professional expertise and experience. Megan is the founding partner of Checkers Financial Management, a San Francisco-based firm specializing in tax and financial planning for high net worth individuals. This female-owned business serves a diverse client base, including entrepreneurs, corporate executives, and families with inherited wealth. Trained as an attorney, Megan thrives on the challenges of navigating complex financial landscapes. Megan holds a BA in history from Bryn Mawr College and a JD from Rutgers School of Law. Her past career includes positions at Goldman Sachs and BNY Mellon Wealth Management, as well as being recognized as one of America's top women wealth advisors. Currently, she serves as a Board of Trustees member for the National Endowment for Financial Education and chair of the Investment Committee, managing a $200 million endowment. She resides in California with her husband, Roger. Without further ado, after this quick message, let's get to my conversation with Megan.
When it comes to what your family eats and drinks, you know your choices matter. You're the expert because you know what fits your life. And getting it right starts with good information. That's why America's beverage companies are sharing more information about our ingredients at goodtoknowfacts.org. No spin, no judgments, just the facts straight from the experts for more than 140 beverage ingredients. Visit goodtoknowfacts.org.
Megan, thank you so much for joining us on Presidencies today. I greatly appreciate it.
Jerry, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, before we dive into your book, because you have so much material that you cover in this, and just I do have to say, first of all, it was such an enjoyable read. It was so informative. And I learned a few things. And as our presidency's listeners know, that can sometimes be hard to do. But I I really appreciate this book. I love the insight and perspective that you brought. And so I just wanted to see what started your interest in American presidents and what motivated you to write this book.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think history should be fun. It's so fascinating studying the presidents, right? For me, I grew up in a very small town, almost 50 years ago. And it sounds weird, but back then we were sort of cut off more from the rest of the world before the internet and everything got us all connected. And so in my small town, I was a reader and I was drawn to reading biographies about the presidents. And I remember being 6 years old and going in and getting the biographies. And my mother, by the way, would always say to me, "Oh, get the one on JFK. He was so good looking." And of course, just to drive her crazy, I would refuse to get the JFK bio. But I was very drawn to their stories. And what you find with a lot of the presidential stories is they are the typical hero's journey, right? And I could relate, being a small town kid, that a lot of them grew up in small towns and left their towns and made their way in the world and sort of were able to be incredibly successful. And you think about the stories that we tell about the presidents, Abraham Lincoln, right? It's right out of exactly what you want to hear for the hero's journey. But Jerry, you and I live in the real world, and we know that's a lot harder in real life. So, in my career, I'm a tax attorney. I work in finance, and I've been very blessed. I work in the ultra high net worth space in navigating all the financial issues that wealthy people deal with. And as I said, I'm a kid from a small town in southern New Jersey. So I learned a lot from watching my clients. And I started to realize they had certain skills, certain traits, behaviors that they would engage in. And so for some of them, those things made them wealthy. And for others, it didn't. So then, like you, I'm a big reader of history, and I'd be reading books. Right now, I was reading a book on General Marshall, and I was reading about the fact that he turned down a job that was, the equivalent of making $400,000 in like 1920. Wow. Like, you read this stuff, and you go buy it in a book very quickly, right? And then all of a sudden, you realize, wait a minute, I live with my own money. I know how hard these things are. And so I wanted to understand, one, how the presidents succeeded or didn't succeed. And I was really curious about the overarching state of the American dream, because we're all taught the same concepts, but has it changed? Is it harder? Is it easier? And what does that mean? So that's sort of the genesis of this book.
And I think that's one thing that comes across in your book is this idea of the presidents are people like us, and some come from very humble beginnings and they have to work their way up. But even really all of them, they have to at some point think about, the day to day. Okay, what money are we bringing in? How are we going to save? Are we saving? Are we in debt? And it's just fascinating, once you get away from those figures on a pedestal and you really see these are people trying to figure out their lives just like the rest of us. For me, that's been the driving force of my podcast and my work as well. I just love being able to see these people as people.
Yes, exactly. And it's funny, like one of the stories I came upon, and part of the story is in the book, and then there are other stories that didn't make the book. But I always was fascinated with John Adams. And I talk about him in the book because his father wanted him to go to Harvard. And John Adams had a tutor, and he had to walk to Harvard, and he takes the examinations for Harvard. And not only does he get in, but he gets some scholarships. And it's not enough to pay for his education. And so his father, and actually the Adams really believed in owning land and not selling it. But his father made the sacrifice to sell land. And so that's how John Adams goes to college. But what I found fascinating is, fast forward, John Adams is married. He has a son named John Quincy Adams. He's in Europe doing, diplomatic mission for the fledgling nation. And his son, John Quincy Adams, is getting a European education. And he's even going to The Hague. And John Adams and Abigail Adams, they're very clear. They want their son to go to Harvard, right? Like, it's the American dream. But John Adams is very clear, like, Harvard's not cheap. And we just had him go to The Hague. So let's hatch this plan that when we go to get John Quincy Adams into college, we want him to not go in as a freshman. We want him to go in as a junior, so that he only has to pay for 2 years of college education. Now, of course, John Quincy Adams, very smart man. He does take the examinations for Harvard. He gets in. There was one class he had to take, do a refresher on. I want to say it was Latin, but don't quote me on that. And he does get to go into Harvard as a junior. And what I loved about that story, right, the bookends, is what's more American than trying to figure out how to pay for education, right? I mean,
Yes.
the prices were probably different, but it's been a consistent struggle over the course of American history. And you see this with a lot of the presidents in terms of them sort of breaking out. But I got to give John and Abigail Adams credit for thinking about getting, John Quincy in as a junior. It's well done.
Absolutely. Trying to figure out a plan to make it happen. But, maybe we figure out something else. Maybe we figured out, what this backup plan is going to be like. And it's just, it is fascinating. And also, that there is this constant, folks want better for their children. And that's part of why they try to manage their wealth, is to make sure their kids are taken care of. And we see that with so many figures, and some do it better than others. And I think that's one thing that comes across in your book, is that there are definitely patterns that you can start to discern of people. There's some that have a good approach. There's some that, their approach could use some work. And I did love at points you're like, I wish I could have advised this person, because we would have worked this a lot differently.
Totally. I mean, oh my gosh. And the thing is, when you get into their money, you're getting into the human side of them, right? So they move away from being like on a pedestal, doing the things that they do in the course of their career, and they become very human and at times, very vulnerable. There's a vulnerability in letting someone see your money and understand it. And so when you go through letters or you go through their ledgers, you start to get an understanding that the stress that we all have, really they had as well. And it's in the beginning of the book, and you probably saw it, but I found a letter Lyndon Johnson writes in like 1942 to a friend saying, I was up at 2 a.m. in the morning, worried about money. And I'm like, that is such a universal feeling. I mean, I wake up at 2 a.m, worried about money. I'm sure you do at times. And that's what makes it sort of interesting when you look at how the presidents behave.
Absolutely.
And it also will change your impressions of some of them. Some of them, like Jefferson, you're shocked to find out not so good with money. Others, like Warren Harding, who you think is the worst president, ends up, he's pretty good with money.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was one of the parts that really fascinated me. And it was funny. I actually shared this with a friend who is a Harding fan, and she's like, oh, I hadn't heard this. So I was like, of course, I've got to bring this up when I talk with Megan.
Yes. Oh, that's great. Yes.
And in that section that you were talking about Harding and his business savvy when he purchased the newspaper in Marion, Ohio, what really surprised me was when you wrote that, quote, Harding took the radical step of turning over minority ownership to a group of employees. In the early 1900s, 25% of the paper became employee-owned. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you would mind talking about Harding's approach to business and how he balanced his financial well-being with his, as you described it, generous spirit.
Yeah, Harding's an interesting one, right? Because we always rank him as one of the worst presidents. But when it came to money, he was quite good with it, right? He grew up probably what we call middle class. And when he was embarking on his career, he looked at being a school teacher, he sold insurance, and he wasn't really drawn to those career paths. And then he and a group of friends found out about a newspaper for sale for $300. And he and two friends buy it, and he eventually buys them out. But you got to think about the time period they're in, right? Like today, it'd be like he was getting into AI, right? Or something that was sort of revolutionary. And newspapers at this time period, in the 1880s, 1890s, they were the way we were really communicating information. And he was very focused, being in the town of Marion, Ohio, of being part of the community. And in fact, the leading scholar on the Marion Star is this woman named Sherry Harding, who actually runs the memorial up there in Marion, Ohio. And what she always talked to me about when we would talk about this is he was very focused on showing others in town that he supported them. So, with Harding, he buys this newspaper and he eventually does have some of his staff buy in and have shares. He also, when you go through his papers, you realize if you worked for him, and by the way, his staff called him WG, which I thought was so cute. WG, if you were in trouble, you went to WG because he would lend you money. And there's documents in the Harding Memorial where they show him lending somebody $5 or somebody's, spouse dies and he's supporting them. So what you find with Harding is he's all about bringing in the community, but he also marries a woman who's quite good with money. And so while Harding's trying to get everybody on the team and supporting them, his wife Florence, grows up with a father who taught her a lot about money. And she runs the finances of the paper. She lets him go out and about. She's running the finances. And there's a cute story about them that Florence was known to have these gallon jars at the Marion Star that she and Warren would put pennies in. And people would see them carrying the gallon jars across town to the bank to deposit the money. So she was frugal and she thought about every penny. But I think this idea of being supportive of your employees, allowing them to buy in, he was part of this sort of revolutionary beginning of what we would call an ESOP, employee stock ownership program. And in fact, when he went to sell the newspaper in 1923, it would also be benefiting these employees. And that was really, really important to him. So I think when you think about Warren Harding, obviously we always go Teapot Dome scandal, right? All those things. Or if you watch John Oliver has done a bit with Warren Harding. But the truth is, Warren Harding was about building a business that really encompassed everyone around him. And I think when I get asked a lot, well, is how they were with their personal money, how did that impact them from a presidential standpoint? I would tell you, he's one of those examples where he was just very laissez-faire in a way. He trusted people. And of course, when you mix politics with this, it's not always the thing to trust. And I think that's where he gets burned.
Absolutely.
But that was really, I think one of the things that's striking about Harding. He had a big heart when it came to people. And the other thing I'll tell you, Jerry, is I did talk to the Harding people about the big rumor that he had gambled away the White House china. There's always been a story that he gambled away the Benjamin Harrison china set. And they told me, interestingly enough, that they'd been asked the question so much that they decided to do an investigation. And they went through all of the papers, all of the inventories of when people, he went into the White House and when obviously he passed away and Florence left the White House. And there's no indication that he ever gambled away the Benjamin Harrison china.
It's always interesting how those myths and rumors start up, and trying to track them down can sometimes lead us into all these different rabbit holes. But that is one that I'm very glad for Harding's sake. I mean, he's got enough on his bad side as it is. So at least we can go ahead and squelch that one.
Well, and what's interesting about Harding is despite having a wife who helped him build the newspaper, as he goes on the journey of understanding in 1923, where he goes up to Alaska and then he goes down the West Coast and he ends up in San Francisco, California, where he dies at the Palace Hotel. But during that time, he's trying to sell the newspaper, which would have been sold for the equivalent of about $9 million in today's money. But he also redoes his estate plan. And in the estate plan, he says, look, if I die, he does something we call a Q-tip in today's parlance in estate planning. If I die, I want my wife to have use of the assets, but at her death, reversion to my wishes, which I thought was fascinating because she had helped him build the newspaper. And, it was one of those things that seemed a little harsh. And she only lived a year after him. And when he died, the transaction hadn't completed, and she completed the transaction on his behalf.
Yeah. Wow. And it's so fascinating, like when you start to look into those stories of how people plan or don't plan for their estates. And I know you brought up George Washington at one point in your book, and the fact that he had the two different versions of his will, and then at the last minute decided which one was going to be the one that was used. But it's interesting, and especially, and we'll talk more about like presidential couples that are closer, but when you have those instances that maybe the spouse doesn't know that, oh, this is what's going to happen, and then, oh, surprise, here you go, we've just got to go along with this. It's really, it gives you some of that insight into the human perspective and what was going on with them and how close, or in some cases off from one another they were.
Right. And Washington, Washington was amazing with money, right? But he's a sphinx. He's such a hard character to get to. But when you go into his ledgers, and by the way, he kept impeccable ledgers. One of my favorite Washington stories is, when he becomes the commander of the Revolutionary Army, he tells them he's not going to take a salary. He's very wealthy at this point, but he tells them, you've got to pay my expenses. And Congress, of course, says, sure, sounds like a screaming deal. Unbeknownst to them, he keeps these copious records. I mean, down to the penny. Like, we actually have his records in the Library of Congress for July 4th, 1776, and what he was buying that day. And so when he ends up, finishing the war winning, he gives his receipts to Congress for $160,000.
Wow.
And of course, they didn't expect the war to last 8 years or that they had this phenomenal budget. They probably wished Thomas Jefferson or James Monroe was the one who was in charge of the receipts, both of whom were not strong with money. So, Washington is this sort of powerhouse. And the thing about Washington, he does make an error in his estate plan, but Washington had a lot of experience with estate planning. When you were wealthy and of a certain landed class in, the early United States, you were often looked to be an executor because death was far more common. And so he had served as executor and done a lot of legal work despite never going to college and not being an attorney. And so he had a lot of experience with estate planning. And in fact, his estate, there's actually a book on it. His estate, once he died, it was open for 50 years. That was how immense the land holdings were and how complex it was. He does make an error, as you mentioned, which puts Martha at peril. But I do believe George and Martha were a love match. I do think, despite the fact it was a merging of two wealthy people, she was incredibly wealthy, he was up and coming, I do think there was a love match there. And I think his error was an honest error in the estate plan.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it is fascinating because you do see, in going to Harding's successor, Calvin Coolidge, you see somebody who is typically held up as, oh, well, he was a great, person with money. He was somebody who he was very frugal. He had, as you described, a quote, firm money philosophy. But you also highlight in your work that in some ways that worked against him. And so even folks who are typically good in some ways, they have their Achilles heel as well. And sometimes they have things that, maybe they should have gotten out of that pattern a little bit. And Coolidge, of course, you highlight, you even went so far as to write that, quote, thriftiness is both a blessing and a curse. Coolidge would have been better served financially if he had a touch of self-interest. So, Megan, I was wondering if you could share more about that with us and what lessons we can learn from Coolidge's example of financial management.
Yeah, Coolidge is an interesting character, right? Cool Cal. And he used to lecture the American public in the 1920s about being frugal. Could you imagine during the Roaring 20s, this is your president? But he grows up in a family and a lot of our presidents had a lot of trauma. He loses his mother and sister very early on, but his family actually has money. And he grows up, his father taught him a lot about how to manage money, but he sort of goes off in this world and it's almost like he's holier than thou, right? Like he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. And, he's almost afraid to be seen doing something for a buck. And there's a part of the frugalness that's sort of fun for him. Like there's a great story about him and his wife, Grace. And, when they get married, they stay at this like boarding house and it was great. It was a screaming deal. They got like 3 meals and they got to stay there. But then the boarding house eventually goes out of business. And so they go and buy on the cheap all the bedding and the plates and everything, even though it says the name of the boarding house on it. So Coolidge, though, when you go through his correspondence, what is really interesting is he tries to be holier than thou about money, but he is also, over the course of his life, receiving an allowance from his father. Now, he becomes very successful as an attorney, and a lot of his work as an attorney is in working with banks, and in particular banks and mortgages. And mortgages back in Coolidge's day were a little bit different. They tended to be 5 years, and they tended to have a balloon payment after 5 years. So he was very focused on making sure he didn't look like he had a conflict of interest in terms of having the mortgage, and he didn't want the banks to have something to hold over him. And so Coolidge and his wife, Grace, always rented. They always rented their house. In fact, they when they came to DC, they continued to rent. And the only thing that they were very sort of extravagant about was their clothing. And this had to do with the fact that his biggest supporter was a gentleman named Frank Stearns, who owned a department store. And Frank Stearns would always help him dress. So if you ever see a picture of Coolidge, one of the historians, Amity Schlaze, told me this, always blow up the picture of Coolidge. And what you'll notice is that the clothing he wears, the quality is impeccable. The level of detail. And Grace Coolidge obviously was a fashion plate of her day.
Oh, yes.
So what's really interesting about Coolidge, and I find this story fascinating, is as Coolidge is finishing as president, ready to go back to his rented house, he gets approached by Charles Merrill, who has been running all around town saying, the sky is going to crash. It's 1928. There's going to be a big bust in the market. And he says to Coolidge, I want you on my board. I'll pay you $100,000. And Calvin Coolidge says, I don't think I have enough experience and knowledge to provide any value to your board. And he doesn't take the job. And of course, well, we know what he actually doesn't even invest with Charles Merrill. I believe he invests with like JP Morgan or one of those companies. And of course, as he's finishing the presidency, it's 1929 early. He puts his money to work and of course rides it all down in the great crash of 1929. So I think with Coolidge, what you see is someone who's hesitant about having money impact him. And he's got this missionary mindset. And I have clients like Coolidge, right, where they're very thrifty, they're very frugal, and they brag about it. They'll call me. They're like, Megan, I booked my vacation through Costco and it was on sale at Costco. There's that pride about saving money. And with a lot of those clients, I have to work with them on, look, rumor is you can't take it with you when you die. Nobody's come back and said, look, I brought it all with me. So I wish Coolidge had been able to enjoy money a bit more. And that seems like an odd thing to say. But money does a lot of things for us. And enjoyment is one of those things. And I really think he was so anxious and stressed and trying to feel conflict free. He never just relaxed and enjoyed it a bit.
Yeah. Well, and it was fascinating that it was only towards the end of his life and after he was president that he finally bought a house. And that was one of the things that you mentioned. You think about how much he spent over the years renting a house versus just buying a house. And it's an interesting juxtaposition. You see like the Adamses who, land is so important. That's where their wealth is versus Coolidge. It's like, I'm just going to hold off for a little while longer, but he's paying all this rent over decades,
right? And if you think about the time period he's living in, it's the time of like the Sears Roebuck catalog, right? Where I'm actually sitting in a 1920s catalog house right now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. but you picked your house out of a catalog and they were beautiful and you'd build it, either you hired someone or you built it yourself. So he was around during this big push in home ownership. But you bring up something interesting because when you think about all of our presidents, right, they all have a different path. But like the first six, right, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Quincy Adams all came from landholding families. Obviously, Adams and Quincy Adams were not slave owners, but they had significant land holdings. And if you ever read John Quincy Adams' diary, thank God for John Quincy Adams, by the way, he kept a impeccable diary over the course of his life. But if you read his diary, they talk about the land all the time and how tight cash flow was. But what I always find really interesting is people are always caught up with Andrew Jackson. And one of the fun things about Andrew Jackson is after 6 presidents who came from money and landholding, we got the president who really came from nothing. And he started the whole poor boy, small town, go out on a journey story. And as you know, Jerry, right, grows up, doesn't even meet his father. His father dies before he's born. He and his brother, prisoners of the British. And of course, everybody in his family pretty much dies by the end of the Revolutionary War, and he's on his own. And he's a poor guy wanting to make his way in the world. And there's a story that some of the provenance is debated, but there's a story about Jackson that he gets an inheritance from a grandfather of his back in, Scotland or something, of about 300 pounds. And he gets it. And he proceeds to go on quite the gambling, running around, spending money like crazy. And of course, spends it all and doesn't really get anything out of it. And I always think that's interesting because today we would call that lottery winner syndrome. And I'm sitting here today in New Jersey. There was the big mega million thing that lottery that just happened. But what was interesting thinking about Andrew Jackson is, one, he's the first poor president who builds wealth. But two, he suffers at that point in his life from something that people suffer with today, which is when you inherit or you win a lot of money, you haven't grown and you haven't earned it. It just sort of comes into your life. And so there's a greater risk of it going to zero than you actually hanging on to the money. So that was one of those fun little stories. And again, the provenance has been debated, and I couldn't find anything that confirmed it one way or the other. But I sort of liked that story about Andrew Jackson.
Absolutely. Well, and it does get to, at least he hopefully enjoyed it while it lasted.
I think he did. And he struggled a lot to make money, right? I mean, he lost money. I mean, back in the day, he was a lawyer and you didn't get paid in cash, right? A lot of times you would get these like certificates that were supposed to be cash substitutes. And what's interesting, if you go back to George Washington's correspondence, Washington at times was very insistent on saying, I don't want like a land certificate, or I don't want this cash equivalent certificate. I want actual money. And, Jackson, for better or for worse, he ends up as an attorney receiving a lot of these sort of, they weren't real money, but they had like a cash equivalent. And he used to joke, I've received either that or pieces of land all around this county that if I patch it all together, I'd be a huge landholder. But, it's all little snips here, there, and everywhere. So he struggled to build wealth and he failed numerous times. But I do think that's why when he actually made money, you see the Hermitage today, you're like, okay, he went big.
Yeah.
But he was a big personality. So of course it was going to be like that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things, and especially studying like the early presidents and the finances and how finance worked in those days, it's quite different than what we think of nowadays. And especially when you start to get to, the push west and what they thought of as the frontier, you didn't have ready cash. You had to find other ways to make things work. And also this idea, that you were land rich and cash poor. This money was in the land, but it wasn't necessarily that you could get it out. And we see with some folks, and talking about those first few presidents, we see so many problems with getting into this debt cycle and not being able to get out of it. And of course, Jefferson is probably the most well-known presidential example of what not to do in terms of financial management. Yeah. But, his fellow Virginians, Madison and Monroe, didn't do too well for themselves either. And particularly for Monroe, and it's fascinating, I started reading about that because we're starting to get into the Monroe narrative series with the podcast. Trying to avoid financial disaster was basically, it defined his post-presidency. That was what he had to focus on. I just wanted to ask Megan, what kind of financial mess did Monroe get himself into, and how did it differ from that of his colleagues and contemporaries, Jefferson and Madison?
Yeah, I mean, when you think of these presidents that had significant land holdings, that was a full-time job, right? And because of how the revolution occurred, how they got pulled in a lot of different directions, they couldn't actively manage their lands. And it was often left to them to find somebody who could be trusted, right? So you're sort of looking for a very hard person to find to manage your lands. And then coupled with that, Monroe looked up to Jefferson. And I love this, and I think I have it in the book, but at one point, Jefferson convinced Monroe to buy a patch of land next to him so they could retire together, which I love because my friends and I, none of us have kids. We all joke we're going to buy land together and retire together. So I love the fact that Jefferson was sort of the early assisted living home. But, with Monroe, his, connection with Jefferson, one, he got to get sent overseas, and he, like Jefferson, had a taste for the high life. Right? When he got sent to France, there was no American embassy. And Monroe, to his credit, understood there was an art to diplomacy. There was an art to entertaining with the French to make it work. And so what does he do? He buys a property for the U.S. government, doesn't really tell them, uses his own money. And then, of course, the government doesn't want to buy it. And so Monroe ends up selling it when he comes back to America at a loss. So you see a series of these mistakes, not actively managing his lands in the United States, making choices overseas. He loved French furniture, right? And then what Monroe really does that's a mistake is he gets convinced time and time again by Jefferson and Madison to take certain posts overseas. And these posts would pay a certain salary, which really weren't significant. And he could write off some of his expenses, but he had to track them. And the truth is, he wasn't that great at tracking them. He was not George Washington. And so he waits until after he leaves his presidency to submit the receipts for things that happened 20, 30 years before. Now, today, if James Monroe showed up, we would be like, of course, James will pay your expenses. But at the time he submitted the bills, he was still a political person. And of course, Congress was like, yeah, we're not going to pay this. And it gets tossed around. And in the meantime, he loses his home. He moves in with his daughter in New York. And he really struggles. And you see this in the letters between Jefferson and Monroe. They both are the two, they talk about it with each other. They understand, because a lot of people couldn't be direct with them. How are you going to be direct to Thomas Jefferson and say, dude, you're losing money. What are you doing? Right? He was so esteemed. Same thing with James Monroe. But Monroe's story is a very good example of what we call in personal finance ostriching, right? Stick your head in the sand and hope it all works out. And, sometimes it does, but more often than not, particularly with, significant land holdings and the level of politics and expenses that were involved, it just didn't work out for him. So it's a really tricky situation. And then, amongst that group, the person I often think of, I feel the worst for. I mean, I feel bad for Jefferson. I feel bad for Monroe. But the person I feel the worst for is James Madison. Because out of those three, James Madison had a very modern problem. And I would tell you, the president, I would say, who had a similar situation is a very modern president, which is Joe Biden. So James Madison and Joe Biden both, James Madison did not have children. His wife, Dolly, had been married previously, lost her husband and son in Philadelphia during, I think it was the yellow fever, and her youngest son survives. And she marries James Madison, and they are overindulgent with him. Okay. Fast forward, Joe Biden, as we all know, in the 70s becomes senator. His wife is killed in the horrible car crash with the baby daughter. The two sons survive. And you see Biden being indulgent with his sons at times, right? So we're running at parallels hundreds of years apart. So, James Madison and Dolly did a lot to get her son sort of situated and set up, and he would ruin it consistently due to addiction. He gambled, he had an alcohol addiction. He just was not the person that they wanted him to be or they believed him to be. And of course, what's tragic is James Madison tries to sell his papers at the end of his life. He doesn't get it done in time, so he leaves it in his will for Dolly to do that. She's able to sell some of the papers, but not at the level that he had wanted to sell them for. And of course, her son helps squander away a lot of the assets that are left. So Dolly Madison lives a very tough elderly years of her life because she just doesn't have the cash flow. And of course, you see this with Joe Biden, right? You see this with, Hunter Biden, obviously self-professed in recovery from addiction. And so I think about these two a lot. And I think about the fact it's a very American issue, right? Which is, how do you teach your children about money? How do you make sure you're not self-indulgent with them? And how do you, when you see them going off course, how do you make sure you don't use money as a way to smooth the path? And so I always feel with Madison and with Biden, take out the politics. We need a lot more empathy for those situations because they are incredibly common.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it is something that is generation upon generation. It's something that comes up time and again. And that's one thing that I think you highlight, and I think is important to highlight with this. It's not just the impact on the individual, but with their families. And one of the things with the early presidents, the fact that you've got enslavement involved in this. And so you've got individuals who are also impacted because the person that they enslaved, we see it with Jefferson, we see it with Madison, you see it with all these folks that their lives are negatively impacted as well. And it becomes a horrific story.
Yeah. Yeah. And we had 12 slaveholding presidents, right? And, slavery is abhorrent, right? What's interesting is, how it works out with them building wealth, right? I mean, Washington, Jackson, Jefferson, I mean, they were all wealthy. And you see that tension with the Adams. When you go through the Adams papers, both John Adams and John Quincy Adams, they did not have free labor. And, they struggled a lot more in a different way about it. So it's a really complex issue in what happens. And in the book, I talk about a lot about James Polk, who slave trades while he's in the White House. And you think about that, and he did it through an agent, so you wouldn't know. But again, this is some of the tensions that are always there with personal finance and the presidents. I've been asked numerous times, like, do presidents exploit their office, right, for personal gain? And what's really interesting is if we go back to George Washington, as you know, Jerry, George Washington was very focused on his reputation and doing the right thing to be the example. And I think because he was like that, there was a lot of public trust in what he did. There's a story where he was going to get from the Commonwealth of Virginia, I think $20,000 of James River Canal stock, which for Washington at that time when he was in the presidency, he needed the liquidity. It could have helped him a lot. But, he talks to Henry Lighthorse Lee and is like, look, I can't accept this. And they decide to donate it back, and different schools could apply. And they figured out one of the schools, Liberty Hall, they gave the money to, which educated Presbyterian ministers, which that school eventually becomes Washington and Lee down the line. But you have in these early years this doing the right thing, trying to abide by the rules, trying to appear clean, right? And I think what's gotten harder with money today is that presidents back in the day, when they retired, they either went back to practicing law, they wrote a book, or they dropped dead, right? George Washington's dead 2 years after he leaves.
Yeah.
And today, people are brands, right? And, it's a lot harder to contain things. And that idea that, you become president and it's sort of the golden ticket, I think has eroded a lot of public trust because people don't believe that politicians are going to do the right thing. The George Washington model just doesn't fit where we are today. So that is some of the inherent struggles we see with money and the presidents over time. And by the way,
Absolutely.
I'll tell you one quick thing. I'm sitting here in Cape May, New Jersey, where I'm from, but down the street from me is a little town called Cape May Point. And it was a town that Benjamin Harrison and his wife Caroline were brought to by John Wanamaker. And if you grew up in the Philadelphia area, you know the Wanamaker department stores.
Yes.
Yes. So they'd come here a summer, and Caroline fell in love with Cape May Point. And it's beautiful, I should tell you. And the following summer, the Harrisons had a house here, purchased by John Wanamaker and friends. And this becomes a financial scandal. So Benjamin Harrison, comes out to the papers and says, no, I'm actually giving a check for the house for $10,000 to Wanamaker and friends. I didn't know if Caroline would like the house, so I wanted her to see it first before I actually bought it. And it cracks me up that right down the street from me is one of these presidential money stories. But it's crazy because they do have the house here. They have it for a few years. And then, Caroline dies early on after he leaves the presidency. So they sell the house. And the house was in a part of this island that has now gone underwater. So you can't even visit it anymore. But, this idea of impropriety, right, and doing the right thing, a lot of the presidents felt an onus to do the right thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is so fascinating to have part of presidential history just down the street from where you're at, that one of these stories are there. And there's so many stories like that I don't think folks know. And, speaking of, and especially speaking of somebody who is seen as betraying the public trust,
Nixon.
Nixon, exactly.
He seems so quaint now, though. After everything since him, he's just sort of quaint.
It does seem like, can we have like a Watergate?
And he's it's so funny when you study Richard Nixon, you realize what an awkward person he is. He's so awkward, and it's sort of heartbreaking because I do think he wanted people to love and revere him, and he, of course, doesn't do a very good job of that. So.
Whenever I think of Nixon nowadays, I think of the picture of him in a full suit on the beach. And it's like,
Yes.
That's Nixon.
And by the way, who else goes on national television in 1952 to read off his net worth? Like, we call it the checker speech. Okay, I one day took the checker speech and sat there and wrote it out, like built a balance sheet from it. And you could build a balance sheet.
Oh, wow.
The Republican cloth coat of hats, the car they had 2 houses because of Washington and California. It was fascinating. I mean, but what an awkward guy to go and read his net worth on national television. And I don't think Pat was pleased. So
I wouldn't imagine.
No, not at all.
I mean, we talk about this idea of, maintaining some sense of privacy, and yeah, no, it's all out there.
It's all out there, including her cloth coat, her Republican cloth coat.
Well, and thinking about him, and there's been so much, of course, written about Nixon over the years, but I think his investment and work with Citrafrost is probably one of the lesser known points of his career for the general public.
Yeah, I know, right? Isn't that a crazy, so in doing the
Yes,
book,
please.
I would be reading stuff, and I would find one little sentence. So as a side note, the book opens with a story about lobsters and FDR, as you know. And of course, I call the FDR library and I'm like, they're like, what can we help you with? Thinking I'm asking about World War II or the Depression. I'm like, no, I want to know about the lobsters. Tell me about the lobsters. So the same thing with Nixon. I call the FDR, the Nixon library, and I'm like, I'm here about the orange juice company. And they're like, we may have some, and it took a while, but they had a folder on it. So a little bit about Richard Nixon. He does follow the path of the poor boy who makes it, right? Richard Nixon's father was one of these people who moved from the middle of the country, from Ohio, out to California, out to Orange County, California. And they opened a grocery store and a gas station. And each of the Nixon boys was responsible for a certain section. Richard Nixon was responsible for citrus. And he grows up in this town of Whittier and, ends up going to college there, ends up going to law school at Duke, and he comes home and he begins to practice law. And he's not a great attorney in the beginning, right? The first case he gets involved in, he sort of messes up significantly. But he starts to do okay, and he's becoming a pillar of the town. And a group of businessmen come together and they have an idea. This one man has an idea. In the early, 1910s, 20s, 30s, what their version of AI was frozen food. This idea of, could you put a fresh glass of orange juice on every table in America, which today we take for granted because we just go and buy orange juice. But back then it wasn't possible. So one of these guys had this idea that there was a way that they could freeze the juice with a gelatin and then ship it across the country and allow it to be turned into orange juice. And so they asked Nixon to do the formation documents. They do what in today's parlance would be called a friends and family round. And Nixon gets so engaged with it, they ask him to run the company. So again, that's how startups happen. It's also how messiness happens, right? Because like a lot of startups, they sort of underestimate the costs. And there's a series of mistakes that happen. So first of all, the big mistake that undoes them is they don't do their Social Security filings correctly for their employees. And so they get fined for that. But there was a issue where there was juice in a boxcar in LA. And of course, juice, the fermentation process kicks in and the boxcar blows up. And there's an image of Nixon that, they were so desperate to keep this company going that he would work all day as an attorney. And then at night, he'd be there pressing oranges to create the juice. And of course, the whole thing goes belly up in 1938. And Nixon is humiliated because it was the town of Whittier. It was these people who he had grown up with, who he had let down. And, when you go through the court filings, he could have had the debt discharged. And he refused. He said, I will pay down the debt. And so he does over a period of years. Now he goes to war. He plays poker. He's a good poker player. He sends money back. And they eventually pay back over a series of years all the debt on Citrafrost. And it's one of these things where it's just a footnote. But I think two things always come to mind. First, if he had succeeded, he never would have went down the political path, because in 1945, what becomes the Minute Maid Orange Juice Company does succeed at the end of World War II. And of course, it's not about freezing the juice, it's freezing the concentrate, and they get orange juice around the table. The other thing is, when you deal with startups, one day I was listening to a pitch call for a startup with a client of mine who angel invests. And the guy who runs the startup says, "You're lucky. This is my third startup." He's like, "I've already gotten through all my failures." And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That's something Richard Nixon didn't get to do in business. Like if he had tried another business or maybe, right, he might have learned enough from this to have succeeded on his business. So of course, Citra Frost is often a little footnote in Nixon bios. The library has a small file on it with a lot of the filings and also Richard Nixon's calculations on the P&L, which is sort of fun to see.
Nice. And it is interesting, we think of so many presidents and so much that could have happened to change the course of their lives, where they went. And that was fascinating to me to read. It was like, we may not have had Nixon. He could have been, this business magnate, and you just never know. And there are so many presidents. And that's one thing I think that you highlight, that sometimes they do learn from their failures. It's important for them to fail. You talk about Grant. I mean, bless him.
Bless his heart. Oh my God. And by the way, like like when you look at Grant, right, he would fail and fail again and fail again. And he was very, very trusting, right? And that he almost was too trusting. But I always think the skills that make them great in some ways makes them fail in other ways. And then you've got like Lincoln on the other side, who does fail significantly in the beginning of his life with money, but he learns a lot from it. And Lincoln, when he dies, is worth $85,000, which is actually $2 million in our money. So, again, failure in money is actually a good thing if you can pivot from it and learn from it. And, guys like Grant, they struggle again and again. Same thing with Jefferson for a variety of reasons. And then others like Lincoln, they learn from their mistakes. They're able to grow wealth and they're able to succeed the right way.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things you highlight in your book is that sometimes having that strong partnership is so important to success. You mention in your book how marriage can greatly increase the chances of building wealth. And you highlight some examples of presidential couples that exemplify this, with, of course, Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson being the shining stars.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you mind sharing more about the Johnsons, how they worked together as partners, and how they were able to achieve financial success.
Yeah. So, they're an interesting combo, right? Lady Bird, she's got a quiet resilience and he's sort of the charismatic visionary who learns how something works and then maximizes it. But the Lady Bird LBJ story is like a lot of presidential stories, because a lot of our presidents marry up. Lady Bird grew up in a well-to-do family in Texas. Her mother dies when she's 4, and her father and her uncle teach her about money. And what's interesting is when she meets LBJ, obviously he grows up poor, and she has money. They get together, they get married really quickly. If you ever want to read something about either correspondence at the LBJ library, is fun. They wrote each other constantly, and he's very charismatic. And you remember, LBJ can convince anybody of anything. And what's interesting is she has this inheritance. So under law, when you inherit property, it is your separate property. It only becomes marital property if you combine it, right? Otherwise, as long as you create a partition, it remains separate in nature. So there becomes a radio station up for sale in Austin, Texas. And this is back in the time where the radio was everything, right? And in Austin, they didn't have a lot of great programs. And, cynical political people will tell you, well, how convenient that the congressman's wife buys a radio station with her separate property. But she does, and she gets really involved in the creation of the radio station. And like any savvy businesswoman, she's running the P&L, she's hiring, she's firing, she's moving to different, better building. And her husband, and you see this in the correspondence, is helping her. And how he helps is they're trying to bring more interesting programming to Austin, Texas. And, it's not like today where, you can go on Hulu or Netflix or whatever. There's not, like at night, the radio stations would turn off. And so between the two of them, and you read their correspondence, she's making the tough business decisions. She's on the ground sort of running the day to day. He does, reach out to people to get help. And for, whether that was right or not, that's for the politicians to decide. But what you see is a very well choreographed dance. And what's hard for Lady Bird over time. And what's interesting, all of the presidential libraries, I should tell you, have oral histories. And so her oral history, I mean, she did a ton of work on this. And then they interviewed like people who worked at the radio station. And so you get in there and you start to really get the crux of the story of how hard she really worked to build this thing. And, you know, when in 1962, they started to have this grand debate nationally about what role president's personal money should be playing. What should we do with it? There actually wasn't an official rule until 1978. And so, you know, the Johnsons debate a lot during the Kennedy years what to do with the radio station. And then when Kennedy is shot, there's a diary entry. Lady Bird she dictates her diary every day. And in her diary translation for, I think, like November 24th, 1963, she mentions that, you know, one of the things that they're coming to meet with her on is to sell the radio and now TV stations. And what should she do? Now, the Johnsons make a decision to use a blind trust. And out of all the presidents who've used blind trusts, they ran theirs pretty much by the book. But they did not divest of the radio station and they didn't sell it. The Johnson daughters sold it in the early 2000s for over $100 million.
Wow.
So you see, though, with them in their correspondence, a lot of shared values, a lot of listening to each other, a lot of responding and hearing each other, you know, and you see that with a lot of presidential letters. You see that with the Adams. They, you know, thank God for the Adams. They wrote each other, you know, constantly, my dearest friend, my dearest friend. And I always love that entry because I'm like, can you imagine? I can imagine being mad at my husband, but having to say, my dearest friend, I'm really angry with you. You know, other presidential couples that were really well matched, the Reagans, Ronald and Nancy, incredibly well matched. He and his first wife, not so much. You know, the Washingtons, very well matched. The Eisenhowers. And of course, Mamie has a great line. Mamie used to say, I have a career and its name is Ike. And I love that about her because she's just sassy. But, you know, the presidential couple I get into in the book that isn't really aligned very well is the Lincolns, and just a very much a financial mismatch for a variety of reasons, different backgrounds, different goals. You know, Mary Todd Lincoln, we can debate what was the issue there to the cows come home. And by the way, anyone who's listening, if you haven't seen Oh, Mary, the play, well, have you seen it, Jerry?
I haven't, not yet.
You've got to see it. It's great. and one thing that was funny when you see the plays, you realize that the guy who wrote it said, I didn't do any research when I designed this. But that's how prevalent her quirks are in our popular culture. So they were very, very mismatched. And you see them, you know, he's taking every part of his presidential paycheck during the war and buying treasury notes and bonds, getting like 6 or 7%, which is good for him. But she's off in New York and she's spending, and you see a lot of compulsive spending. You see a lot of lying around the White House and her trying to foist bills off to different departments to pay for some of her incredible spending. And so very mismatched. And probably the saddest footnote in that story is when Lincoln dies, he didn't have an estate plan. And so even though he knew how she was, he was an attorney, he had premonitions of death, he didn't leave an estate plan. And so Robert Todd Lincoln brings in the Chief Justice of the United States, and they decide to split it a third to Mary Todd Lincoln, a third to Tad, and a third to Robert Lincoln. And so Mary Todd, of course, struggles financially over the course of her life. And she struggles just generally.
And that's one thing that I think you really highlight in your book is that for so many of these presidents, in trying to build their wealth, they're thinking of what happens after. You know, I want to be able to set up my wife, my family, to be able to have something once I'm gone. And in some cases, you see, like with Lincoln, that he didn't have a plan for his estate, versus Washington, and going back to, you know, his will and how that worked out. You know, even this person who thought he had it all figured out, and then the plan kind of goes awry because he didn't think all the way through the plan.
Correct. He didn't understand how the language could be interpreted. Interpretation's important. It really is.
Yeah. And so would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, you brought it up earlier. Washington, you know, when he leaves the presidency, he's excited to go back to Mount Vernon, and he decides to draft 2 versions of the estate plan. And what really is the provision that's sort of difficult for him is what happens to the slaves at his death. Now, remember, he had slaves, and then his wife had dower slaves, right, that came with her dowry. And so he puts in the estate, one version he has says, at Martha's death, if Martha shall survive me, at her death, the slaves are freed. Now, he has two versions of the will. He's dying. He asks Martha to bring him both copies. He looks at them both. He throws one in the fire, and the one that stands has this verbiage. So at Martha's death, the slaves are to be free. Now, this is the most famous man in America, if not one of the famous men in the world. His estate plan is published everywhere around the world. And people find out very quickly, including the slaves, that there is this provision. And so if you go to Mount Vernon today, they'll show you, and you're on the paths back there, there'll be a sign that says this is where there was a fire after his death that the slaves set. So there became this sort of feeling that Martha was at risk. And by the way, if I was one of those slaves, of course. I mean,
Absolutely.
come on. Slavery's horrific. And so Martha is frightened. And what happens is Martha is visited at one point by Abigail Adams, who is not a slaveholder and not a fan of it. And Abigail writes a friend afterwards and says, look, I just saw Martha. She's not doing well. And basically she's afraid. And so she's decided to sign a writ of manumission, which means Martha freed the slaves before her death. And Martha doesn't live that long after George, to be fair. She was very heartbroken at his death. They were, by all accounts, a very close couple. But, if you had told George Washington, if you had pointed out the language, he probably would have been like, oh my God, I'm going to get my poor wife killed with this language. It was a drafting error. And these happen today. I often tell people it's good to read out your estate plan and make sure it flows and that the money makes sense flowing through the words. So that was Washington's sort of error there, which is a shame because it was one of those things where he had done a lot of really good, strong financial planning moves, but that one was definitely a miss.
Absolutely. And like you highlight, Megan, in your book, thinking of the post-presidency and thinking of estate planning for, the early presidents like Washington, it looked so much different than it does nowadays. Post-presidencies, we typically expect that former presidents are set up to do quite well, but that wasn't necessarily the case back in the day. So would you mind speaking to kind of what it was like for presidents in the past and what role Gerald Ford played in changing how post-presidential finances work in the modern era?
Yeah. So, as I said, people finished the presidency and they died. They went back to practicing law, which is what Lincoln had talked about doing. He wanted to travel and practice law. Or they wrote a book, right? Eisenhower, Truman, Nixon, they all write books. But Jerry Ford's an interesting character in American history. The more you study of him, the more respect you end up gaining for him. And he was the right man at the right moment, even though he was an accidental president. But he was also a man who had always been in public service. And he lived paycheck to paycheck. And when he and Betty move into the White House, and by the way, for the first week he's president, he still goes home to his house because the Nixons haven't moved out yet. So at one point during this first week, he's like, hey, when do I get paid? Because I got to pay the mortgage. So he gets in the White House and he doesn't really have a lot of money. They have like a condo in Vail. They've got like a house in Virginia and that's it. And his congressional pension. And, he's president for a short period of time. He loses Jimmy Carter. And in fact, in the 1976 election, there's a lot of press about the fact that Carter has all these assets. And, Reagan was in the mix there at one point. He has all these assets. And then you got Jerry Ford, who's worth like a couple $100,000, not a lot compared to the competitors. And so Ford loses the election and he takes it very personally because most of the presidents will say it takes about 2 years to figure out the job. Right. And he had just passed the 2-year mark. He was just getting the hang of it. And he's like, look, I'm young. I'm like in my early 60s. I don't want to play golf all day. What am I going to do? And one of his speechwriters was like, look, remember we were doing all the bicentennial stuff? You should talk to Norm Brokaw. Now, Norm Brokaw, we don't know, wouldn't recognize the name today. But back then he was the agent. He was the Ari Emanuel of his day, right? Like he was the agent for all the movie stars. He had met Ford because of Mark Spitz. That was the first time they met when he brought Mark Spitz to the White House. And so they got together and they came up with this master plan. One, a book, but they were the first, Buddy and Jerry were the first presidential couple to get a joint book deal for a cool $1 million. He was going to do speaking engagements. Okay. Makes sense. Sounds very benign today. Back then, it was actually a bigger deal. And then the third category was entrepreneurial endeavors. And in the book, I get into one of them because he had this idea. He'd gotten to know the Franklin Mint people very, very well because of the bicentennial. Back in the 70s, when you bought those medals or whatever they were selling, people believed they were going to appreciate in value. It was a very popular stock to buy and everything. But by the time he leaves the presidency, that company's struggling, but they convince him to do like the medals of the presidency. And could you imagine today you open a magazine and there's Jerry Ford pitching you medals from the Franklin Mint. And of course, he gets lambasted for this entrepreneurial endeavor. And he basically stops it right away and he goes in another direction. And the direction he goes in is the one that Coolidge turned down, 40, 50 years before, which is he went on the board of publicly traded companies. And when I was going through the oral histories, it was really interesting. Ford always got a different deal than the other board of directors. It was always special. And Sandy Weill, who ran Citibank, Smith Barney, he was in the oral histories. And he said something which is contradictory to what Calvin Coolidge thought. He said, when you bring a president of the United States onto a board of a very large multinational company, you are getting very unique advice. They see the world differently. They understand it at a very different level. And we were always willing to give Jerry Ford a very different pay package because he brought something to us that no one else could do. So when you think about the presidents since Ford, Carter sort of was like, he put his nose up at the Ford thing, just so you know. By the way, during his presidency, his blind trust ran up all this debt. He had to come out of the presidency and write a lot of books, but he and Rosalynn don't spend a lot of money. Yep. Reagan obviously was sick. Bush wrote books, but Clinton took it to the next level. He did speaking engagements everywhere around the world because he had to pay off all the legal debt. And then we get to the Obamas, who now have a production company and they do podcasts. And it's so what I love about this ever evolving post Jerry Ford rule is that people are finding different ways to evolve it differently. And, I think amongst the Fords and the Bushes and the Clintons and the Obamas, and we just saw Joe Biden sold his memoirs and so on. What is interesting is they've all tried to keep some purity to the presidency. They don't want to denigrate it, but they've been able to expand it. And you can watch Michelle Obama on her podcast with her brother. I mean, who'd have thought we'd be talking menopause with Michelle Obama? Not typical first lady stuff. So it's interesting what Jerry Ford did. But, I would tell you this, Jerry, I think we are at an interesting crossroads where you go back to Washington and people trusted him and he always thought about his reputation. And today people don't trust politicians because they think they're all gaming the system, right? I mean, Pew Research surveys people. I mean, the numbers are dismal on American trust in politicians. And so, blind trust, the 1978 rules of disclosure, those things I think really need to be revamped and in a way, when someone becomes president, I think one of the questions I ask myself all the time, and I'm a business owner, is if you became president, would you be willing to divest your business because post-presidency, you've built a brand and per the Jerry Ford rule, you're going to make a ton of money. Yeah. And this is one of these things where I think we as the American public need to be clear that it's some of the stuff that goes on now might not be completely acceptable.
Absolutely. And like you said, Megan, it has been one of those things that folks have thought about for, over 200 years now of the presidency of what is the right thing to do, because ultimately these are people who, have bills to pay. They have families that they want to support. They want to leave something to their kids. But at the same time, how far do you go with that? And where do you start to violate, ethics? And how does it impact ultimately the presidency? Because the presidency is larger than any one person.
Right. It's hard. One of the things I have a lot of respect for the Bush family, and I talk about it in the book, is the Bush family sort of has a mantra, right? Which is each generation must carve its own path. So, you think of Prescott Bush, he's the senator and a businessman on Wall Street. George H.W., who, by the way, if you read his letters, he's so sweet. He's so cute. H.W. obviously moves to Texas, back in the late 40s, early 50s when nobody's doing this and works in oil. W starts in oil, he's not really successful, but then he goes into baseball. And then today, you look on the Today Show in the morning and there's Jenna Bush Hager. And whenever I see Jenna on TV, I always think to myself, there's the Bush family financial philosophy at work, which is, look, I woke up on third base, but I'm not going to just follow the path that the one before me did. I'm going to do something different. And I give that family a lot of credit. I think that they are a very good model of what you can do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Megan, I could not let you leave without asking about Herbert Hoover because
my crush, my other crush.
Yes, as you noted in your book, he obviously made quite an impression on you from a financial management standpoint. So I was just wanting to see what most surprised you in the course of your research about how Hoover approached his personal finances.
So I will tell you one thing. When I did each president at a time, and every time I would be deep into studying a president, I had a huge crush. There was a while there I was like, oh my God, I love Dwight Eisenhower. So my poor husband watched me have all these oh my God, I love this one. They're so sweet. Because again, I wasn't looking at their political stuff. I'm looking at their money and their personal lives. So Hoover's an amazing rags to riches story. And it's one of these stories where a lot goes wrong and he's able to pivot and survive. And he grows up in Iowa. His family were Quakers. And his father was they had been farmers, but his father was entrepreneurial, had a store, was really the family moved from this little house that when you go to West Branch, Iowa, you see, to a bigger house in town. They were on the up and up. And his dad dies of a heart issue when he's 4. His mother then struggles for 5 or 6 years. She's a preacher for the Quakers, and then she dies. And you've got these 3 orphans. And the Quakers did something very interesting. And I get asked all the time, how do you teach your children about money? And obviously, you don't want to follow the Hoover path exactly. But what the Quakers did is each of the Hoover family took one of the Hoover kids. And then there was a gentleman named Laurie Tatum, who was a senior elder of the Quakers, and he ran the money. And so as a young boy, Herbert Hoover would have to work on his budgets because they would submit them to Laurie Tatum to get access to the capital. And it just, when you study when you're supposed to do things at certain ages, Hoover tracks perfectly. So age 10 to 12 is when you're starting to move from basic arithmetic and buying and saving to how do I budget? So he's doing that at that time. They move him to Oregon. And by the way, they put him on a train to Oregon to live with another uncle. And they give him a giant basket of fried chicken for the route. And I always think about that. I'm like, oh my God. He goes to Oregon. He's living with this uncle. His uncle, when he's 15, makes him a bookkeeper. Think about this. But this is all, right, you're evolving the skills. And then he gets into Stanford. And he's in the pioneer class at Stanford. And Stanford, no tuition, but you had to pay for room and board. So he has a laundry business. And I get into the book about the football team that he saves financially. Mm-hmm. But Hoover gets out of college. And we're in a panic. It's right after the panic of 1893, right? We always think we're the ones that graduate in a recession. I graduated in a recession, but it's very typical in American history. And so he gets out, can't find a job in geology. And so what does he do? He goes to the Sierra Nevadas. And he goes there and he gets a job pushing a cart down into the mines.
Wow.
And the miners are Cornish. And so they're at first they're like, who's this crazy kid? But then he works like crazy. So they start to teach him things. And they're like, hey, you see, when you see this is what this means. And this is what this means. And he spends a few months down there. And then eventually he gets a job at a company. He basically convinces this company to hire him. They wanted to hire a 30-year-old. So he grows a mustache and takes a boat to England with the mustache and tries to look 30. And this company hires him to be in charge of their mines in Australia. And mining in Australia was miserable in the 1890s, right? And then the early 1900s. I mean, you're riding camels. At one point, Hoover did get a bike. But between what he learned at Stanford, managing money with the budgeting, and going in the mines with the miners, he's going around one day and he sees this spot he had heard about, that it was an old mine. And he's looking at it and he does this analysis and he writes his bosses and he says, look, there's gold here in this hill. You need to buy it and you need to make me partner. Go Hoover. And they do. And he hits gold. He hits a gold mine. I mean, this thing, I think it threw off over $50 million worth of gold over the 50 years. So he would get ownership stakes in these mines. So they moved him all around Australia. They moved him to Asia. He has, gold mines and diamond mines and all this stuff, right? And of course, what's so important to him is the Quaker message, which is the money isn't about you, it's about helping others. And so in his correspondence, whenever he's writing home, he's got a friend that manages his money. And he always says, Lester, if any of our friends need money, give them money, just don't tell them who it's from. And he's always giving his money away, very much like Harding. And of course, this spirit of money and community, it ends up being to such a point that he's not a great president, but not once, but twice, he uses his budgeting skills and his sense of charity and community to go and feed Europe twice and save them from famine. So if you ever go to West Branch, Iowa, and you walk in the gardens at the Herbert Hoover Library, there is a statue from the people of Belgium thanking him from saving them from starvation. And if he wasn't a good budgeter, if he hadn't learned the finance stuff and learned how to manage a balance sheet very early in life, he would never have been able to succeed financially like he did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing, like you do occasionally get these presidents and their presidency is honestly the worst part of their life.
Yes. Warren Harding, Herbert Hoover. Yes. It's really not the best of times for a lot of them. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up our conversation, Megan, I wanted to ask you, what do you feel is the key takeaway from your book for readers? And what was the key takeaway for you from your research?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that I sort of took away is, everybody's always stressed about money. I work with wealthy people. I see the stress. But I think we're all trying for this American dream, right? And I talk about this in the book, which is, I do believe the American dream is still possible. And Americans are believing it less and less. But what I would tell you is it's gotten harder than ever before for a variety of reasons. Lack of financial literacy, longevity, right? Just the inability to live and not live paycheck to paycheck. Healthcare, education. We are just getting hammered every which way. And it is so hard to be what the goal of finance is, to be financially resilient. And so I want people to walk away knowing you're not crazy. It is harder than it's ever been in American history. And it was always hard. Ask George Washington, ask Abraham Lincoln. They would have told you it's really hard. So I want people to not feel crazy, because I think there are times that people feel like, wait, what am I doing wrong? Why can't I achieve this? Why am I struggling and living paycheck to paycheck and don't think I can save for retirement, care for my parents, and send my kids to school? And I think the thing for me is the thing I sort of walked away with besides that is I think that it's time for us to really think about using personal finance of the presidents and elected officials, and what do we need to build around them to create public trust. The public does not trust, and they have a lot of reasons not to, because again, I work with corporate executives, and when you work with CEOs, they're not allowed to buy and sell their stocks, right? They have to hold their stock. I don't understand why we have such strict rules for corporate executives, but if you're a member of Congress or you're the president, there's not that many rules. And so it's time. It's time for us, because I think it's important for Americans to have faith.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better way to wrap up this conversation. For our listeners, the book is All the President's Money: How the Men Who Governed America Governed Their Money. Megan, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for the insight that you provided, not just in this conversation, but in your book. And for our listeners, there are plenty more stories in the book, so I highly encourage you to pick it up. Megan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Jerry.
Special thanks again to Megan Gorman for her time and the insight that she provided in this discussion. There are so many more tidbits and stories from her research that we did not get a chance to address in our conversation. So I highly recommend you check out her book, All the President's Money: How the Men Who Govern America Govern Their Money, in order to learn more. I'll have a link to the book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There you can also find past episodes of the podcast, links to learn more about all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. Special thanks to all the patrons of the podcast, including our newest patron, Dalton. In a review that he left for the podcast, Dalton said that, quote, Jerry leaves no stone unturned with his deep dives into our presidents. It's one of the most comprehensive podcasts I've come across. Thank you so much for your kind words and your support, Dalton. If you'd like to support the work of the Presidency's podcast for as little as $1 a month and get access to an ad-free feed of the podcast, as well as special patron-exclusive episodes and other patron perks, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up. Other ways to support the podcast include fulfilling book requests on my research wish list or leaving a rating and review at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else that has a rating feature. Sharing information about the podcast on your social media or with those history lovers in your life is always so helpful. So thanks to all of you who, in your varied ways, have supported this little podcast that could over the years. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. Or you can connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.